Topic notes 5.7 Marine algae and plants. Now this picture shows a pipefish, which is kind of like a really straightened out type of seahorse, and they live in and amongst some of this seagrass and algae. And that is really the cool thing about marine plants is how much life they support. The main idea is that marine plants provide a source of primary production and critical habitat that support diverse ecosystems. And these learning goals give you very targeted terminology, anatomical features, and economic and ecological importance of the various different plant groups that we're going to talk about. Now, we've already talked about phytoplankton as a major producer in the marine environment. Now we're going to look at some of the larger marine producers, such as macroalgae. Now, we've given you some examples of that already in kelp and seaweeds, and also marine plants, including seagrasses and mangroves. Now, these are all what we call photoautotrophs, of course, meaning that they do make their own food using sunlight. One of the lesser known marine producers is going to be macroalgae. Now, macroalgae is found all over the place in coastal communities. It's just overlooked a lot. Now, they are not vascular plants. They do not have internal vessels to move things around. They also don't have true root systems. Let's look at a couple of examples here. On the bottom left is one of the more common examples called caulerpa, which is a type of green macroalgae found on the bottom. It's often called feather algae as well. Now in the middle, we have pedina, which is often called scroll algae. This is a type of brown algae. On the right top, you'll see halomedia, and this one is actually calcium infused, and it's often called oatmeal algae because when it dies, it actually flakes off in these little oatmeal-like segments. And then on the bottom right is gracilaria, which is this like tubular branching red algae. Now, as you can see, there's quite a bit of diversity in macroalgae. These are all from the tropical Florida and Caribbean region, and you can find them right out here in our waters. Let's look at the anatomy of a macroalgae. So the body of the macroalgae is known as the thallus, and it has three main parts: the holdfast, stipe, and blade. Now the holdfast is that strong root-like structure that anchors the macroalgae to the seabed. Now that is not a root system. It does not absorb nutrients. Then we have the stipe, the long, tough vertical stalk that is similar to a stem in plants. And from the stipe, you generally have the blades, which are those leaf-like structures that hang in the water and absorb light and minerals. Now, gas bladders are present in some macroalgae depending on their need. They essentially help to provide buoyancy, which, again, is useful for producers that need to stay upright in the underwater zone to help absorb light. There are quite a few calcareous macroalgae, as I mentioned before, and that can add as they die off and break off into pieces to the calcium carbonate on the seafloor. Also, generally speaking, macroalgae add to the productivity of seagrass beds. You often see macroalgae mixed in with seagrasses. Now, as you go deeper, some of those macroalgae species contain additional what we call accessory pigments for in terms of chlorophyll, in terms of being able to absorb different wavelengths that reach a little lower, especially some of that red light that's available. When we talk about the ecological importance of macroalgae, one of the poster children for that would be the kelp forests. Now, kelp forests are found on the west coast of North America, all the way up and down the California coast, up through Canada, and they are composed of brown macroalgae species. They require nutrient-rich, clear water to really do their thing, and it's pretty cool, between 8 and 16 degrees Celsius. Now, the rate of growth is in optimum conditions can be incredibly high. One genus, for example, can grow up to about 0.5 meter a day and reach up to 80 meters in length. That's pretty incredible growth. Now, they do provide a huge amount of habitat for the flora, for the animals that live in those areas. So the diversity is increased, but also there's an increase in productivity in nearshore ecosystems because of that kelp. Now, we've already mentioned this before, but sea otters, of course, are a keystone species here, maintaining a predator-prey balance in the kelp forest, specifically with sea urchins. Now, when we look at economics, macroalgae, specifically kelps and seaweeds, have been harvested for thousands of years. And there has been a more increased demand of late, and especially when we look at China and Japan. Now, commercial farming or mariculture has become an international industry with about 8 million tons produced annually, about $6 billion worth in terms of economic benefits. How it works is that seaweed is seeded onto nets and ropes in sunny areas and generally warmer temperatures, and then they are brought up and harvested. Now, has a lot of different uses, in cooking especially. They're, for example, used for the wrapping in sushi rolls. And of course, why? Because they're rich in vitamins and proteins and minerals. Now, in the food industry, we use them for a number of things. There's sources of biochemicals that help to make solid gels, and also for emulsifiers, which kind of hold substances in suspension. Here's a few examples, like Algae, which is used to form a gelatinous substance that you find in ice cream and synthetic caviar. Agar is used in a few things, vegetarian jellies, for example, and they also use them to test antibiotic resistance with bacteria. Carrageenan is also used in chocolate milk chocolate bars, things like that. Macroalgae aren't just used for food, they're used for other things as well. For example, from cosmetics and herbal medicines, we use them for moisturizing skin creams and remedies for things such as arthritis all the way to the common cold. We also use them in fertilizers, which means they are a source of nutrients for farmland. And in aquaculture, we process them into these little pellets for feeding various different organisms that we're growing, including abalone, which is a type of mollusk. We're going to start shifting out of algae and start looking at actual marine plants. And here's just a few bracketed kind of categories to know. One would be floating plants. That would be like water cabbage, things that float near the surface or on the surface. Now, we also have emergent plants. Those are rooted in substrates that project above the water's surface. Now, we have examples of those such as mangrove forests and salt marsh plants. When we look at submerged plants, we're looking at plants that are rooted into substrate, but they remain beneath the waterline. An example of that would be seagrasses. Speaking of seagrasses, let's talk about them. Seagrasses are actually true flowering plants. They are not classified as grasses, but they do form these underwater meadows in shallow coastal waters, ranging in temperatures between 4 degrees and about 24 degrees Celsius. Unlike macroalgae, seagrasses actually have a well-developed root systems. Now, roots are structures at the base of a plant that anchors it to the substrate and absorbs nutrients from the sediments. They often use what we call rhizomes, which are horizontal underground structures that enable seagrasses to reproduce asexually, meaning as those rhizomes shoot out away from the body of the parent plant, new shoots emerge. Now let's look at the different features of marine plants in general. Now we have a leaf, which you would have on terrestrial plants as well. They are the photosynthetic organ of the plants. Their epidermis layer is where the chloroplasts are. Now, differences, however, from land plants is that marine plants generally don't have the stomata. Of course, they're underwater, so that makes sense. Now, they tend to have very thin, waxy cuticles, and this allows for more direct access to mineral nutrients in the water. They are also very flexible because they do have to bend with currents and waves and tides. As they are in seawater, they have some adaptations to prevent water loss through osmosis. They also have specialized air cells called parenchyma that help deliver oxygen for aerobic respiration. Seagrasses are flowering plants, and a flower is a sexual reproductive organ of plants, and they release pollen, and it is carried by the currents. And you can see a picture of a flower from a seagrass on the bottom left. They don't quite look like flowers in the on land do, but they are there. Now, seagrasses can grow very rapidly. They can grow up to about 1/2 inch per day and up to about 10 tons of leaves per acre per year. So that's a lot of biomass. There are actually about 7 species of seagrasses here in Florida, but we are only going to talk about the three major ones that you see out there all the time. The first of this is Halodulirhydii, also known as shoalgrass. Now, Halodulirhydii would be your genus and species name, your binomial nomenclature, and they're really important. They have an annual production in Florida of about 182 to 730 grams of carbon per meter square per year. Now, their features, they are very thin, flat leaves, and they tend to grow close to shorelines. And there's a reason for that because they tend to be the seagrass that can tolerate exposure to fresh water and even some exposure to air from time to time with low tides. They are a pioneer species that sort of make inroads into new areas. Next up is manatee grass, Syringodium filiform, and their annual production in Florida is between 292 and 1,095 grams per carbon per meter square per year. That's big. Now they are known, and they're kind of very different from the other seagrasses because they are round spaghetti-like leaves, so you can kind of roll them in your fingers. They are generally found in the deeper water and can't tolerate fresh water or exposure to air. When people think about seagrass, it's usually turtle grass, and that's because they have this very classic, very wide blade, and they have these thick meadows. So turtle grass is its genus species name, Thalassia testudinum, and their annual production in Florida is around 329 to 5,840 grams of carbon per meter square per year. So this is by far one of the larger producers in terms of seagrass. They have, again, those tough, broad, ribbon-like leaves, and they tend to be, again, found in the deeper water, and they can't tolerate fresh water at all. Now, when we say deeper water, we're just not talking like a couple of feet. We're talking 3 or 4 meters, like something in still shallow water where they're able to get plenty of light. A lot of times in the Florida Keys, you'll see beds of mixed manatee and turtle grass surrounding patch reefs on the inside of the major coral reefs, but they can be 10, 15 feet deep, that kind of a thing. Let's talk about productivity and the food web and how this factors in with seagrasses. Now, there are actually very few species that feed directly on seagrass. Now, manatees, obviously, they do. Green sea turtles do. There's a few urchins and some parrotfish that do as well, but most of the energy captured from the sun by seagrasses are released as detritus as blades get shed and become detritus. Now, detritivores, which both filter feeders and deposit feeders, feed on the bacteria and other microorganisms that work on dead organic matter. That means detritus is very important to the cycling of this system. Now, on top of that, seagrass supports a large community of what we call epiphytes and epifauna. Now, these are things that grow on and live on seagrass blades. And if you look at seagrass in a healthy area, you'll often see a lot of different algae living on the blade itself, some even encrusting invertebrates, and also invertebrates like little shrimps and snails that work the whole area. And this provides increased surface area for living. It increases a lot of productivity within the system. Unfortunately, seagrasses do face a number of threats. Now, the propeller scars that occur, generally due to accidental boat groundings, are really problematic because they cut the rhizomes and the root systems. This essentially produces fragmentation within the habitat and increases erosion, which means wider and wider gaps of just sand start to appear. Of course, seagrasses need light because they have to photosynthesize, right? So when you have decreased light attenuation, essentially meaning that you have less light reaching the bottom, this is a problem, and it occurs during eutrophication and sedimentation processes, and this can decrease seagrass abundance. A few of the causal factors for this include sedimentation that comes off of land due to runoff, and nutrient loading, which is essentially excess nitrogen and phosphorus coming in due to runoff as well. Seagrasses are massively important to the ecology of coastal systems, especially here in Florida and other tropical regions. Seagrass are sensitive to water quality, and that often means that they're a bit of a keystone species, not only as an indicator, but also as a supporter of so many different types of animals. They are the dominant producer in these coastal systems with phytoplankton, and that is really important as well. But that high level of detritus production is incredibly important as well. They provide home for adults and juvenile species, both in shallow water, but also for hiding places and to help reduce predation on some of those targeted species. As many as 40,000 fish and 50 million small invertebrates can be found in a single acre of seagrass. They help stabilize sediments, decreasing turbidity. Remember, turbidity is about clarity of water. They occupy less than 0.2% of the world's ocean, but hold 15% of the ocean's total carbon, so they are a carbon sink. Seagrass blades absorb wave action and slow currents, so that helps protect shorelines as well. Again, reducing that turbidity, trapping silt and sediments, and they help absorb nutrients from land and runoff. Obviously, they can't take all of the nutrients that come due to eutrophication that occurs, but they help curb that effect. And of course, they produce oxygen. The presence or absence of seagrasses really changes the dynamics in terms of energy availability within an ecosystem. Turtle grass, for example, is consumed by sea turtles, manatees, and herbivorous fish. And one of the problems we have here in Florida is that our manatee population is finding it hard to locate healthy seagrasses to feed on. And this is a problem, of course, in terms of some of our recent manatee deaths that we are having. There's also this predator-prey relationship between sea turtles and sharks that is also tied up into seagrasses. Now, when we look at conservation programs, we have to look at a comprehensive approach that takes into account the complexities of the interrelationships found between seagrasses and other species. And that is all for today. Just a reminder of that big idea here. Marine plants provide sources of primary production and critical habitat that support diverse ecosystems. And until next time, keep learning.